Hello and welcome back to Strategy for Breakfast, where we're hungry to know what makes people and organizations successful. And here on our YouTube channel, we're continuing our conversation with Francisco Martin-Rayo. He's CEO and co-founder at Helios. And Helios is a platform that really helps firms identify agricultural supply chain disruptions before they happen, also using AI. And we'll be talking a bit about that. So this conversation is the extended version, our second cup of coffee to me, in my conversation with Francisco in our recent podcast, where we covered off on some of the changes that we're seeing in the market with volatility, with tariffs, and how that's really setting up a perfect storm of sorts in terms of commodities. So I want us to take a deeper dive into commodities and the state of trade, since there's so much to talk about, right, Francisco?
Absolutely.
I'm your host, Kisa Shreen from the GDS Group. And Francisco, I'm so grateful you could take some more time with us. Just a bit of background, Francisco and I met in 2023 at Oxford University. We're both Imagine program participants. And in that program, we focused on circularity, supply chain, agriculture. And Francisco, I'm sure I'm missing something. What am I missing there?
I think we did a lot of sustainability and a little bit on technology and how we can help. Yeah.
Okay, technologies, right? AI, sustainability. So, and since then, you've made huge strides with Helios, acquiring impressive partnerships and clients. So, let's get into it. We talk a lot about economics and financial journalism. Econ is in my DNA. We're going to talk about terms that will resonate with my economics community, supply, demand, and substitutes. But first, what are some headwinds and tailwinds you're seeing right now with supply chains, specifically where commodities are concerned?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question, and it's such an interesting time for us to have this conversation. Over the last 35 years, give or take, we have been able to benefit, especially in the commodity space, from relatively stable global supply chains. That means you as an executive could look out and say, I'm going to source my cocoa from Ivory Coast. I'm going to source my sugar from India. I'm going to put it all together in, I don't know, Belgium, and then I'm going to send it over to the United States. And your considerations were really focused on, can I trust my suppliers? Are they going to give me the quality and quantity that I expect? And then you're going to try and create the highest quality product at the lowest, cost possible, and maximize your margins and sell it into the right markets. That was the world that we grew up in professionally, right, Kisa? That's changing. And I think obviously it's changing for two reasons. One is what we're seeing today in terms of the new tariffs that are happening across different parts of your supply chain. And so for the first time, you really have to take geopolitical uncertainty into your considerations and say, well, I don't know what the tariffs are going to be for me to source, sugar in India in the future, or coffee in Vietnam, cocoa in Ivory Coast. So you have to take that volatility into consideration. You've seen what's happening in the Red Sea with the Houthis, right? That makes it a lot more difficult for ships to traverse. So maybe they have to go around the Horn of Africa. Say, well, I might not be able to get the shipments that I got, that I purchased in 3 to 5 days. It might take 10 days. So you have to put that into consideration. And then at the same time, with all of this uncertainty that's happening, you also see an extraordinary acceleration of climate change. Last year, it was the first year that on average, we went above the 1.5 degrees centigrade, which means some places are a lot hotter. We're already seeing the impacts on kind of commodity supply chains, all-time high prices for coffee, for cocoa, for avocados. You're just going to see that accelerate. And so it's a brutal time to be a commodity trader. Lots of money to be made if you can ride the volatility in the right way, but a really dangerous time for investors.
So let's talk about possible solves, right, for that. We hear a lot about predictive AI and how that's really supporting those in supply chain to really get a sense of the direction to go in. I was reading the other day about Chipotle. I think they're looking at sourcing avocados from places other than Mexico. So
yeah.
How would an organization use AI to the best of its ability to really maximize their knowledge about where to go, where they can have, substitutes in terms of products, or even where to get these commodities?
Yeah, one of the things that, to be a little more optimistic, right? You have these really difficult trends happening in terms of how and where you're sourcing. But on the positive side, technology has just evolved dramatically over the last few years. So one of the things our platform does is, we look at 500 billion climate risk data points. We cover 64 commodities across 85 countries. So at any point in time, we can go into the platform and understand how is the global tomato, mango, cocoa, corn, soy harvest doing? Where are you going to be able to source more effectively from? Where are you not going to be able to source? Where price is going to go? Where disruption is going to happen? That would have been impossible to do 3 to 4 years ago. And so what's really exciting about this moment is you typically have your hedge fund analyst or your procurement analyst trying to take a look at this global supply chain, reading all these reports, trying to come up with the right risks and mitigants and all that. You don't need that anymore, right? An AI agent like Cersei, other AI agents, the Helios platform is able to ingest millions and millions of signals in real time and help you predict where those disruptions are going to be. Totally different way of working.
Wow. So with the thought about predicting where disruption, so you understand where the disruptions are, you understand where to now move to. Let's talk about in that context, supply, demand, and substitutes. And I love this use case that you have, Francisco, because I didn't know that Brazilian oranges were a thing. And substitutes from the econ perspective, there are substitutes for chocolate.
Yeah.
And when I think about oranges, I think about Florida, but maybe I've been thinking about that wrong. So let's talk about these different places where there are actually commodities that maybe we didn't typically think about, and they can be sourced in other places.
Florida is a great example. So Florida, Florida's natural. It used to do 200 million boxes a year of oranges. That's down 95, 96%.
Wow.
So most of the orange juice that we're drinking in the United States actually comes from Brazil. Even the Florida's natural oranges. Right?
Never would have guessed it. Never would have guessed it.
No. Florida doesn't really do oranges anymore. And that's been a combination of disease and climate change. And so that's a good negative example, right? The climate change has totally transformed what you can grow, how you can grow it. You're no longer really growing oranges at scale in Florida. But if when you think of Italy, you think about tomatoes, you think about pasta, you think about wine. You don't think about mangoes.
No.
What's really interesting is over the last 10 years, Italy has increased by 100 times the number of hectares that it's planted for mangoes.
Get out.
Because as the climate has changed, the Mediterranean basin continues to get hotter and hotter and hotter. And the climate now more closely resembles some of those tropical areas where you could grow mangoes. So that's a good example of countries trying to take advantage of the changing climate and grow new things for export.
Wow. Okay. Let's talk about cocoa and chocolate, because a lot of us are really concerned about that. So what are the substitutes there? Are there things being grown in different places where we can substitute it for the cocoa beans?
It's such a great question. The hardest part about cocoa is it takes about 5 years to plant a cocoa tree and then really be able to harvest it. Mm-hmm. And so what you're seeing is, Ghana and Ivory Coast, the places that are exporting the most cocoa, you're really being impacted by climate change, disease. Your trees are kind of old. You haven't really reinvested in those plantations. And even if you do, you don't know if you're going to be able to get the same yields because, again, your climate has changed. So people are starting to do more work in, they're trying to plant in Indonesia and Ecuador, but you're still, 3 to 5 years away before you have some degree of substitution to help the market. Yeah. So in the meantime, I think chocolate will go back to being a kind of a luxury good, unfortunately. And you start to see it, right? You see the shrinkflation. You get one Easter egg instead of 2 or 3 because they're so much more expensive, and the Easter egg is a little bit smaller, and maybe it's more of a milk chocolate base with 20% cocoa and just a lot more sugar and stuff.
Okay. So again, how can we take what we have and stretch it? How can we substitute it? And also, if we look at a value add or looking at the glass half full, if we are in a region that produced X commodity 50 years ago, maybe we no longer have that climate, literally that environment, but we might be able to produce something else now because of the shift. So really taking the data and the information that we have about climate and being able to look at what we can produce in today's scenarios.
That's exactly it, yeah. And if you're a large procurement leader, your job is to identify those places that you are going to be able to source from 5 to 10 years from now and start building that supplier capacity.
And that's where that technology comes in. That technology can really help us understand that.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. So And capitalizing on volatility, we talked a bit about this earlier. I want to dive more into it. We're seeing now lots of volatility. Hedge funds come to mind. Could you take us through the strategies some of your hedge fund clients are using and help us understand how, for some entities, institutions, and individuals, a down market and high prices at the grocery store for us can mean big business and profitability for them? We talked a little bit about that earlier, but I want to go into detail as to how you're seeing clients really navigate what's going on right now.
Yeah, one of the things that's unique about the commodity market that I think it's important for your listeners to understand is you're typically levered, 5 to 10 times to 1. And so if you have a 2% change in the market up or down, that's really a 10 to 20% change. In cocoa, when you've had these, 10, 15% change, that can wipe you out in a day. And so there's different ways that you have to approach, those trades, depending on what you're trading, depending on what your risk appetite is and how long do you want to be in the market. You can do incredibly well. We saw a lot of kind of money managers do very well on the upside for cocoa, but then you also saw how quickly it went from 12,000 down to 7,000, independent of the fundamentals. And so one of the things that's really important, and I think you see this, Kisa, more than anyone, right, across your different asset classes, is understanding that as you have more people interested in trading commodities, you're going to have increasing volatility. As you have increasing volatility with leverage, that can be a combination where you can do incredibly well, but also get wiped out pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to continue to see that increase in volatility over the next at least 12 months. Through a combination of climate change, of tariffs, geopolitical uncertainty. And so it really is the managers who are starting to take bets on, independent of the movement. They'll just say, we think there's going to be a lot more volatility, or we think there's going to be less volatility. And you're going to start making more and more bets on that instead of the directionality of the price.
And so that's really your role to help these hedge funds get a sense of what's coming down the pipeline using AI technology.
Exactly. Yeah. And what we really focus on is helping them understand what are the fundamental impacts of climate on these prices. Climate, until tariffs became kind of the primary driver, but the underlying primary driver of commodity prices is climate, right? Either you have a good harvest or a bad harvest. That continues to be the case, but now you have the added volatility of this geopolitical uncertainty.
So take us into the future of AI in agriculture. Circularity and the difference in agriculture globally is something we spent a lot of time thinking about when we were at Oxford, right? So I want to know where we are now. You mentioned a few years ago that this didn't exist, where we are now versus where we might be in 5 years, 10 years, and what might be some of the variables that will push using AI in agriculture to go a lot further than it is now.
Yeah, I'm actually incredibly optimistic about what's happening in technology. When we spend a lot of time on farms, and farming is ultimately a business of hope. You have incredibly small margins. Anything wrong can happen when you plant, when you're growing, when you're harvesting, and your season is done. So you really have to love what you do because it's not a business for the faint of heart, I would say. Yes. But there are a lot of inefficiencies there. There's inefficiencies in how you are putting fertilizer in the ground. There's inefficiencies in terms of how you're doing your water distribution. There's inefficiencies in terms of how you're predicting pests. There's inefficiencies in terms of how you're predicting climate change, climate disruptions, weather. All of that is getting better with artificial intelligence. And so you have a future where even smallholder farms are able to leverage kind of cutting edge technology that can tell them, here are the places in your acreage that are a little drier. 3 weeks from now, we're expecting actually a drought. So you want to put in additional cover crops. You want to put in a certain type of fertilizer, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe next season we're expecting a much wetter type season. And so you want to plant a different type of crop as you're cycling through. All of that information is now available. And the beauty about it is just making it cheap enough and easy enough to use for all farmers to leverage. We give our platform to farmers for free. We've never sold to farmers. So we have a lot of farmers that are just now on the platform, and they use us to both identify, well, how are all my competitors globally doing, and use that to price and when to sell. But also, how is my own farm going to do in 6 months, 12 months, 18 months? What does that forecast look like? What's the climate risk? And use that information to better inform their decisions.
So I'm hearing you say that the farmers have this platform for free, and also what you said earlier about it's not for the faint of heart. You really have to love what you do. And in our industry and supply chain and manufacturing, just like in farming, there seems to not be as many folks entering those fields. We talk about talent and where to find talent. And I'm wondering, I'd like to get your thoughts on what should upskilling look like for those of us in supply chain and in commodities fields in the world we're living in today with these variables we just discussed. So what should we be teaching the next generation and even ourselves right now? What should we be relearning? What have we needed to go back and think through, relearn to make sure that we can be better in our professions?
My hypothesis, and this is a bit controversial, is we really have to go back to the basics and make sure that we as adults and our children coming up in the world are learning how to think. And what I mean by that is truly first principles thinking, because I'm 40 years old. I've had a very good career, thankfully. I worked in finance, I worked in consulting, I run an AI company now. But for the first 15 years of my career, I was paid basically to read things and come up with thoughts and write analysis or reports or come up with ideas and sell them to different clients. That job, that has basically disappeared. Right? Generative AI can do a better job of that than I could for the first 10 years of my career. I took a class at Stanford last year, and they make you read these cases and then you have to write what you think of the cases. And I took those cases, I put them through ChatGPT, nothing special, and said, hey, tell me what you think of this. And the insights were about as good or better than anything I would have made. And to me, it was a real reckoning, because what is my value add if my analysis of the case is worse than a generic LLM's would be? 10 years ago, you would have said, hey, if you should learn how to do coding, you should learn how to do data science. If you're a 22 to 24-year-old right now graduating with a data science degree, you don't have a job. Because all of the jobs that you would have done as a junior data scientist, engineer, have now been overtaken by AI. We only hire intermediate and senior data scientists, engineers, because we don't need those junior folks anymore. And that, I think, is a really interesting world, because how do you differentiate? How do you succeed? I really do think you have to relearn how to think and then be comfortable leveraging and using a vast range of different tools that are now available to be successful.
So take us through the relearning process. What does that mean? And take us through the tools that are really important now that maybe some of our listeners should think through, taking some courses on, or at least learning more about them.
It depends. I think at a basic, right? Like, you should have some basic understanding of how to code in Python. You really need to understand how to do prompt engineering well. Prompt engineering is a fancy word for learning how to ask generative AI for the things that you need. So I am not a technical founder. My CTO and co-founder is. I am a pretty good prompt engineer. Despite not having that technical background, I'm really good at getting generative AI to do things that I need it to do. If you add kind of some basic Python knowledge, then you can start tying it to different data sets. And then you could really start creating that automation that is really magical. But it is important, I think, to spend a lot of time, especially in your vertical, whether it's investing, finance, HR, back office, front office, whatever it is, really engaging with generative AI and understanding how it can make different parts of your job faster and better. Because those are the people that will succeed in the market. Think about it basically as a natural distribution, right? And so in the natural distribution, you have folks who are doing more repetitive manual tasks, folding towels, for example. You're never going to automate that. You could, but the ROI is not that good. It's relatively expensive to do so. At the high end of that, you've got neurosurgeons, folks that get paid a ton of money. Those folks are already working with AI. They're going to do incredibly well. So they're going to continue to do well. They'll get paid even more. The folks at the bottom of the natural distribution, their jobs aren't going to be automated. They'll continue to have those kind of very manual, repetitive jobs. It's the folks in the middle that makes up the majority of the middle class that are really going to be impacted, because a lot of those jobs can now be automated using generative AI. And so the reason, how you survive if you're in that middle is by leveraging the tools that are available to you.
Wow. And I hear you talk about some of the learning tools that you've leveraged. I know you were at Stanford this year. We met at Oxford a couple of years ago. Would you recommend that to folks who really want to dive deeper into this world of agriculture, specifically using AI in agriculture? What would you recommend, particularly those who might not be straight out of school? If they see the shift happening and they want to accelerate their career in this way, what would you recommend in terms of how to learn at this stage in the game?
I would start, find a company that you admire or enjoy and start engaging with them. Use their products. If you can do a hard pivot, going to work for them, great. In a lot of cases, that's very difficult. Offer to do an internship, even if it's on the side, on the weekends, at nights. Build up those skill sets. We've had interns come and work with us where they really wanted to get into the climate space. They didn't have the skill sets for us to hire them, but we were happy to bring them on a part-time basis. And they would do some work for us. They would learn about the business, and then they were able to go out and get kind of that full-time position. But this is not the time to go do a 2-year degree, right? If you're in your 30s or 40s and you want to do a pivot, don't go spend $150,000 doing a 2-year degree, because things are changing so fast that you take 2 years out of being in the market, you'll be even more obsolete. And you'll be $150,000 in debt. That's not a place you want to be.
Not a place that you want to be. Fantastic last words to hear. Just being very mindful and thoughtful about how you approach career acceleration. Also, in this conversation, we talked about how volatility can be a positive thing for certain market participants. We also talked about AI, particularly in agriculture, and how that's really changing the game and allowing shifts to happen that can allow us to forecast and really do a better job of understanding where we can get our commodities from in the future and what we need to think of in terms of substitutions around commodities. Francisco Martin-Rayo, CEO at Helios, thank you so much.
It's great to be here.
Great. And we hope you've enjoyed watching Strategy for Breakfast. For more content, check out our Strategy for Breakfast podcast on Apple and Spotify, or wherever you like to listen. And if you'd like to join us at a GDS Group event, find out what's coming up next at gdsgroup.com. I'm Kisa Shreen. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.